says in the Yerushalmi in Yume that every generation that the Beis Hamikdash, the temple, wasn't built in their days, we consider it and we look at it as if the temple was destroyed in their days. And the question is, why do we relate to it in that way, that if it wasn't built in their days, it was destroyed in these days? And the answer is that every generation really has to learn deeply what were the reasons that caused the Churban Habayis, the destroy of the temple. And if they would learn the reasons and they would correct the reasons that because of that the temple was destroyed, so the temple would have been built in their days. So therefore, if the temple wasn't built in their days, so we could relate to it that it was destroyed in these days because that they had the power, if they would learn the reasons and they would correct those reasons that because of that there was destroy of the temple, they could have built the temple. Because the HaKadosh Baruch Hu would have built the temple if they would correct those reasons. And if it wasn't built, it means that they didn't correct. That's why we have to look at it that the temple was destroyed in their days. So the message that comes out from that Yerushalmi, that every generation has to make a tremendous effort to learn and to understand what were the reasons that because of that the temple was destroyed, and what could we fix, what could we correct those reasons. And then there's a question if we succeed or not, but we have to make the maximum effort to try to correct those reasons that because of that the temple was destroyed. So I would like to relate to the Gemara in Yume in Tisha Amud Beis. The Gemara talks over there, Mipnei ma chorav bais rishon, why was the first temple destroyed? The Gemara brings the three worst averes, like it was mentioned before, Gilo Arayas, Shvichos Domim, and Avodah Zorah, idolatry, myrrh, and adultery. Then the Gemara says after, a couple of lines after, that in Bais Sheni, in the second temple, people were learning Torah and keeping mitzvahs. So why did that happen? That the second temple was destroyed? And the Gemara answers, because of sinas chinam, baseless hatred. The Gemara goes into a discussion after which sins were worse. The sins that happened in the time of the first temple, or the sins that happened in the time of the second temple. And there's two opinions in the Gemara, Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish says that the sins of the first temple were worse. And he brings a proof to what he said. Right after that the second Beis Hamikdash, the Churban Bais Sheni, people were sitting and learning and fulfilling mitzvahs. And comes Reish Lakish and says that if the sin of the second temple would have been worse than the sins in the first temple, there couldn't be such a situation that people are sitting and learning and fulfilling mitzvahs. If it was deeper, that sin was deeper, couldn't be such a thing. And if people, right after the second temple was destroyed, were sitting and learning, so it must be that the sins of the first temple, they were worse. That's Reish Lakish's opinion. Rabbi Yochanan comes and says no, that the sin of the second temple was worse. And he brings a proof to what he says. Because we see 70 years after the first temple was destroyed, we had the second temple. Birot Teichiach, the building of the Beis Hamikdash, that will be the proof. It came back for the first people 70 years after the first temple was destroyed, it came back. But after the sins of Bais Sheni, we never had Beis Hamikdash again. So there's two opinions in the Gemara, which is worse? The sins of the first temple the people that did in the first temple, or the sin of the people, what they did in the second temple. And each one brings a proof to what he says. And this Gemara really is a very hard Gemara to understand. There's a couple of questions that's supposed to be asked. First of all, how could there be such a discussion which sins are worse? Let's go by the name. The three Averos, Gimel Averos Chamuros, of Shvichos Domim, Avodah Zarah, and Gilui Arayos. What's the name for those Averos? Gimel Averos Chamuros. They're the worst Averos that they are. So how could there be a discussion that one opinion is, that's Rabbi Yochanan, the one opinion is that the sin that happened in the time of the second temple is worse. You're dealing with three Averos that they did in the first temple, that their name, and everybody knows, the special halachas of Yorod Valyavo on those Averos. So how could it be that there should be an opinion that comes and says, no, the sin of the second temple is worse? And even the opinion, Reish Lakish, that he held that the sins of the first temple was worse, he didn't say this simple thing that we're saying, because that they are the three worst Averos that they are in the Torah. He did not say that. He went and bring a proof to what he's saying. Because I see a situation and people are sitting and learning. But why didn't he say it more simple? These three Averos are the worst Averos that they are in the Torah. Another question is, what would Rabbi Yochanan really answer on that proof that Reish Lakish brought? He said that if the sin that people did in the second temple would have been worse than what they did in the first temple, how could it be that people are sitting and learning and fulfilling mitzvahs? Why isn't that a strong proof? What would Rabbi Yochanan answer on that? And the last question is, Rabbi Yochanan, when he spoke about that the sin of the second temple is worse than what people did in the first temple, Rabbi Yochanan said a sentence, Toivo tzipornon shel rishonim mikreson shel achronim. The fingernail of the people that lived in the first temple was better than the stomach of the people that live in the second temple. And we know that any example that's brought in Chazal has something deep that it's coming to teach us. The question is, what does Rabbi Yochanan want in this example, and what do we see in this example more than the simple idea just to say that the sin of the second temple was worse than the sins that were in the first temple? So to the answer to these questions, I would like to make an introduction of something that says in a couple of Svarim. Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, in the Igeras HaMuser, he talks about the idea everybody knows that there's a Yetzer HaTov and Yetzer HaRa, a bad inclination and a good inclination. Says Rabbi Yisrael Salanter that the Yetzer Hara, the bad inclination itself, is divided to two. There's two kinds of Yetzer Hara. There's one Yetzer Hara where a person can have a good heart and he's a good person, he has a good nature, he doesn't do bad things, but comes a Yetzer Hara from outside, an external Yetzer Hara, something that comes out from outside and puts him in a test, in an nisayon. He has an nisayon. It's not something that he lived through his life. It's something new. It's a test that came from outside. And then the person has to work on himself. We daven every day that we shouldn't have a test. But nisayon can happen to a person. It's something new that came to him from outside, externally, it's a and his job is to fight it out, even that it came suddenly as a test that came from outside. But there's another kind of Yetzer Hara. There's a kind of Yetzer Hara that a person is born with a bad nature. And then his job is to work to change something in his nature. And we see it in a lot of places. Will be one example. The Gemara in Shabbos, Daf Kuf Nun Vov, Amud Aleph, the Gemara brings that if somebody is born in certain times of the year, so he'll have a nature that's something that will connect him with blood, with shfichus damim. So the Gemara advises that he should gear it to the right way. He should take something that's connected to blood and connected to mitzvah. He should be a shoichet, he should be a moyel, he should find something that's really connected to his nature, but he's gearing it to the right way. Because if he won't, so he has something bad in his nature because he was born in that time of the year. But we see such a thing that sometimes it's an internal Yetzer Hara. It's a Yetzer Hara that's with him inside, that he has to work to change that nature. If he feels that he gets mad sometimes, if he feels that COVID speaks to him, those things are in his nature. It's not an external Yetzer Hara, it's not an external bad inclination that's coming from outside. It's an internal inclination. It's a Yetzer Hara that's coming from inside. The same point that Nefesh HaChaim brings in the beginning in Shar Aleph Perek Vov. The Nefesh HaChaim says something very interesting over there. That the first man, when he was created as a good person with no bad in him. There was not an internal bad inclination when HaKadosh Baruch Hu created Adam HaRishon, the first man. He was kuloi toiv. That's why we really see that when the Yetzer Hara came and spoke to them in the time of Adam and Chava, so it came like a snake from outside, because it was an external Yetzer Hara. It's something from outside coming and trying to speak to me to do a sin. Because that Adam HaRishon, there was nothing in his nature within him. He did not have an internal Yetzer Hara. It was only something from outside. After the sin, the Lashon of the Gemara is in Shabbos, in Daf Kuf Mem Vov, the Gemara says, Bo nochash v'hitil bo zuamo. He put the tumah of the sin, the impurity of the sin, he put into Chava. What does that mean? There's a couple of Pirushim, but the Mefarshim say that it for sure includes that from when they did the sin, in the time of the first man, there was a change. Till then, it was only external Yetzer Hara. From then, it was an internal Yetzer Hara. It was something that went into the person itself, and then it was a new job, and it was a new war for the person to fight something that's within him, that even though he feels that it's a nature in him, he has to fight it out, and it's even a bigger nisayon. Till when was that right? Till Matan Torah. Till the time that Kadosh Baruch Hu gave the Torah to Klal Yisrael. In that time, the Lashon of the Gemara is Posko zu Amoson, that the dirt, the filth of the sin stopped. And that's why really, we said a lot of times in Shir Shel Yoim, Kadosh Baruch Hu told Klal Yisrael that I thought in the time of Matan Torah there'll be no more death. Ani omarti Elokim atem uvnei Elyon kulchem. I thought, and Kadosh Baruch Hu was saying that from now, you'll be like angels. There'll be no death, because it's connected one to the other one. If there's an internal Yetzer Hara, there has to be death. But from when Posko zu Amoson, and there was no more internal Yetzer Hara, they went back to the level of Adam HaRishon before he did the sin, that the Yetzer Hara, the bad inclination, was only external and it wasn't internal. And that's why that pasuk says, the same pasuk that Kadosh Baruch Hu says, Ani amarti, I thought that you'll continue as angels, but ochen ke odom tumusun. But really, you're going to die like the gzera that was an Adam HaRishon when he did the sin. And why? Because then the internal Yetzer Hara came back, and therefore there has to be death again. And really, we see in the Gemara that in the time of Matan Torah, where we said that HaKadosh Baruch Hu told them that they're like angels and they don't have anymore the external Yetzer Hara. So we see it clear in the Gemara. It says that in the time of Matan Torah, when the Yetzer Hara came, when the Satan came and wanted to convince Am Yisrael that Moshe Rabbeinu was not coming back, and from that the sin of Chet HaEgel started. How did he come? So the Gemara says, Bos Satan ve'ir beves ha'olam. They saw a Satan coming and he mixed the world, and he showed them that he wanted to convince them that Moshe Rabbeinu was not coming back. He showed them as if there's a bed of Moshe Rabbeinu that he's died already. And they said, V'zeh Moshe ish. They could point on Moshe and say it. So it's exactly like the point that we're saying, that in the time of Matan Torah, before the sin of Chet HaEgel, so really that bad inclination was only from outside. It had to come from outside. Because when they got the Torah, Poskozu Amason, the dirt of the sin stopped. Poskozu Amason. The only way that the Satan could have come in is something from outside. Like at the time of the first man, what happened then is that the snake, the Nachshon, came from outside because they had only an external bad inclination, only an external Yetzer Hara, not something that's internal. That's why the snake had to come from outside. The same thing happened again in Matan Torah. When they got the Torah and they were pured and Poskozu Amason, they had no more beard inside, and the Yetzer Hara came, he had to come with something from outside. That's Lashon Gemara, Satan ve'ir beves ha'olam. He mixed the world, and he came and he showed them something from outside. That's something that a person could be a good person, but then he's going through a test that you show him something that mixes him up. So after we know that difference, that there's two kinds of bad inclination, that there's the internal one and the external one, we'll say one more point. The Goen, in Masechet Baba Basra, he says that the main thing that makes the difference in our days, if a person will have, after we have today, both of those Yetzer Hara, the internal Yetzer Hara and the external Yetzer Hara, what makes the difference and what's the main war of a person? If his internal position, spiritual position is good or bad. He said that the main thing is emuneh. Because the Gemara in Makos, at the end of Makos, says that Chabakuk came and said that the root of all the good mitzvahs and all the good things that people could do is connected to one thing. V'tzadik be'emunosa yicheh. A tzaddik will live with emunah, with faith in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and when he trusts HaKadosh Baruch Hu, so that's a root for all the mitzvahs. It's a root for the mitzvahs between him and God, and it's a root in the mitzvahs also between him, bein Adam lechaveiro, between him and his friend. And why? Because that any person that has a full emunah, a full faith in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and he trusts HaKadosh Baruch Hu completely, so he never cares to what something happens by somebody else. Why? Because he understands that what somebody else has is not connected to what he has. And it's wrong to think that if he'll have less, I'll have more. HaKadosh Baruch Hu has enough to give to each one exactly what he needs. And if somebody really believes in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, he knows that that's what's good for him, he has. And he's sameach b'chelkoi. He's happy with what he has. So the Goen says that the root of all the mitzvahs is like the Gemara says, and like really what the Navi says, v'tzadik be'emunosa yicheh. And Chavakuk says that he came to say that if a person wants to concentrate on one point, to come out from that point to all the Torah and mitzvahs, he should concentrate in emunah and bitachon. But there's two opposite extremes. The opposite to emunah, says the Goyen, is the last commandment, because that these two things are roots for the whole Torah. So the Goyen says that we see it in the first commandment and the second commandment. The first commandment is the commandment of emunah, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, because that's a root for the whole Torah kula. The last commandment is lo sachmoid, not to desire. And the Goyen says that that's a root for all the bad things. Also, Chaim Vital mentions that in Sharik Dusha, that lo sachmoid, to desire something that somebody else has, that's a root for all the bad midas that could come out from it. When you desire something that somebody else has, from that, because of that you could hate him, because of that you could steal from him, because of that you could get to murder. All those things, he calls it Avatumah. The father of all the toldos of the Tumah is the Chemda. On one side is the Emunah, Ubitochoin, that you have faith in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you trust in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and the other side is when you live in a way that you desire what different people have, and that's what brings you to all the sins. And the Goyen says that this idea we could see in the Simone Atayre and Simone Tume that we have in the birds and the animals. There's birds that we could eat, there's birds that we can't eat, also in the animals. There's birds that are kosher to eat, there's animals that are kosher to eat, and there's ones that we can't eat. And there's Simone Atayre, signs of purity and signs of impurity. The birds that we cannot eat is the birds that it's called the Of Dores. Is those birds that they pray for their food. Those birds don't live from something that they have within them. The only way they live is they go and they kill different birds, and they live from that. They live from the death of different birds that they kill and they eat them. Says the Goyen, this sign on the bird is coming to tell us that like the bird itself has that nature, whoever eats something that has a bad nature could get a bad nature. And that's why the Torah said that we can't eat those birds that pray for their food because they have something bad in their nature. That they don't eat from themselves, they go and they have to pray for their food. That's what we see in the birds. The birds that don't do that, we could eat. In the animals, we have two signs. In the animals, we have the sign of Male Gero, they chew for their cud, and we have the sign of Mafris Parso, that they have a split hoof. What are those two signs? So the Goyen explains, those two signs show us that these animals do not kill different animals to have something to eat. They eat in the yard of their owner or in a different yard, but they don't go and take from somebody else for their food. The for sure don't kill. If you have a mafris pass, if you have a split hoof, so then you cannot kill, that animal can't kill a different animal with the foot. And the Malagera, so she has food in herself that she eats that, and she doesn't go and eat from different animals and different people. So these simonim, say the Goyen, are coming to show us also that each person could learn from it to assign on himself. If somebody is strong in emunah, if he has faith in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, if he trusts HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and he doesn't think the whole time what the other person has, and he doesn't think the whole time that he's not satisfied with what he has, he's a sameach bechelkoi. If he has that, that's a root for all the mitzvahs in the Torah. And the opposite is right also. If he desires something, like those animals that we saw that they're not kosher to eat, because that they always take for their living, they live on what they kill different animals. That bird that's oif deres, she lives because she kills different birds. Or those animals that kill for their living, they take from somebody else. That's supposed to be a sign for us also. What's the main mile of a person is, if we want to check if his internal inclination is in a good position, he should check how strong he is in emunah. If he'll be strong in emunah, bitochon, then he won't have the internal bad inclination. It will only come from outside. And there's a big difference if it's the external or the internal Yetzer Hara that works in a person, like we'll see. The Medrash Rabbah says that in the Galus, in the time of the first temple, when Bnei Israel went to exile, they went to 3 nations, Yavon, Bavel, and Modai, 3 nations. And the Medrash says that those nations were compared to 3 animals, to 2 kinds of rabbits and to a camel. What's the point in comparing them, those nations, to those animals? So the Mefarshim explain, and the Goyen says that also, that those animals, we have animals that have only simonei Torah, only signs of purity. We have animals that have only signs of impurity. But there's some animals that it's divided. The camel and the rabbits, the 2 kinds of rabbits, shofan v'arneves, as it says in the Medrash, so they, outside the sign, they don't have the sign of mafris parcel. They have closed foot. They could kill different animals. So the sign that they have outside, the external side, is a tumor, is a sign of tumor. It's an impurity sign. But inside, they're male gero. They have a sign of purity inside. Says the Goyen that we know that any punishment that Bnei Israel gets is measure to measure. It's a mido keneged mido. So the explanation in this Medrash that Klal Yisrael exiled to these 3 nations that are compared to these 3 animals, because like those 3 animals had outside, they had a sign of impurity, and inside they had a sign of purity. That's exactly coming to tell us what was the sins in the first Beis Hamikdash. The sins in the first Beis Hamikdash was sins that was outside. Even though the Averas, like we said before, were Gimel Averas Chamuras, the worst Averas that there was. But inside, they had Emunah and Bitochen. And even it says something interesting in the Gemara, that even though they did such bad sins, they had faith in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu will understand them and forgive them and won't give them a punishment. It was wrong what they thought. But that shows, like the Goyen says, that the main point to check a person, if his inside, if his internal inclination is good or bad, so the main point is, does he have emunah and bitochen? What that he desires? The people in the time of the first temple, they had bitochen in Hashem. But there was an external Yetzer Hara that came from outside that they couldn't stand against it. So therefore they fell. But even what they fell was outside of them, was from external Yetzer Hara that came from outside. But inside, they were good people and they had bitochen in Hashem. That's why they went to those 3 nations that are compared to those 3 animals that show exactly that point, that there's a sign outside that they're tumeh, they have simonei tumeh. They have impurity signs outside. But the sign inside, they have a sign of purity. Because that shows what the people in the first temple, what they are. And when Hashem gives the punishment, He gives measure against measure to understand that will bring the people to understand what exactly the sin was. In the second temple, they went to exile to Edom. Edom is compared to a chazir, to a pig. Where over there, it's exactly the opposite. He has a siman Torah outside. He has mafris parsa. He has a split hoof. And really he shows it to people. He shows it to people, I'm Torah. I'm pure. But he doesn't have the sign of inside, the siman Torah inside. He's not ma'alegero. He has a sign of impurity inside. Because that comes to teach us, like we said, and the people of the first temple, it comes to teach us that the people in the second temple, there was something wrong inside. Basis hetred, the sinas chinam that comes from something that's wrong inside. Something is wrong with your nature. It's not a bad inclination that's coming from outside, like we saw by the first man that the snake came, or we saw in the time of Matan Torah that the angels came and showed, the Satan came from outside and showed the bed of Moshe Rabbeinu and he's dying. It's not the external Yetzer Hara. It's an internal Yetzer Hara. Sinas Chinam is an internal Yetzer Hara. When somebody has Sinas Chinam, it shows us that there's an internal problem in the person himself that he has to work on it. That's why in the second temple, when they went to exile, they went to Edom and not to those three nations. Because that shows, Kadosh Baruch Hu shows in the punishment itself what kind of sin it was. And he showed them through where they went to exile. Over here going to exile with problems that are external problems. And over here going to exile to a nation that they're compared to a pig, that over there you see that the problem is an external internal problem, that she's not malagero, the pig is not malagero, and therefore that will show what kind of sin they had then. Now we'll go back to the questions that we asked on the Gemara. We said that the Gemara goes into a discussion which sins were worse, the sins of the time of the first temple or the sin that was in the time of the second temple. And we asked a question, how could there be such a discussion to talk about what's worse? Everybody knows that the first temple was destroyed because of those three major big averos that are called, the name is three averos chamuras. How could there be such a discussion to start to talk what's worse? It's simple. For sure that the sins of the first temple were worse. And even Rish Lakish, which held that the sins of the first temple were worse, he didn't say it so simply because that they are the three major big affairs, the three worst affairs that they are. He said something else. He said, not a svara. He said, I have a proof that it's like that because people were sitting and learning after that the second temple was destroyed. But he didn't say it so simply. The answer is that it's not so simple. Because the Goyen says that a lot of times a person could fall in a bad sin. But if inside his internal position, spiritual position is a good position, he could be in a better level. There's an aspect that he's in a better level than somebody that his sin is less, but it's an internal sin. An internal sin is so bad that even in the level, that the level of the sin itself can be less, but it shows what's going on in the person's heart. It's a sign. Therefore, there could be a discussion which sins were worse. It's right. We know that the Aveira itself, for sure, there's no doubt about that. The three Averas Ramos are the worst Averas in the Torah. But how did it happen to the person that he fell in those Averas? if it happened from something external that came from outside, and it was hard for him to stand against it, but inside he's a good person with a good nature, we have big hope with him. We could give back the second temple because there's hope with somebody that inside he's a good person, even though that he fell with things that are very, very major, like the three big averas. That's why also Rish Lakish, when Rish Lakish came to say that the sins of the first temple were worse, he did not come with that because it's Gimel Averas Chamuros. Because he knew what Rabbi Yochanan is saying over here. He knew that there's an aspect to look at it, that the sin of the second temple was worse because that was an internal problem. It was the Yetzer Hara that came from inside. But he said, I have a proof that after the second temple was destroyed, people were sitting and learning. So that's the answer for those two first questions. We asked the third question, what will Rabbi Yochanan answer on what Rish Lakish said? Rish Lakish said that after the first temple, the Jews, they won't be able to sit and learn because they were so deep in those three averas. And after the second temple, we saw that they sit and learn. So there's a very interesting answer. It says shortly in the Goyen says that like we know that in the sins that somebody does because he falls from the external bin inclination, from the Yetzer Hara Chitzoni that comes from outside, and there's averas that are inside, internal averas that in some aspect they're worse. The same thing is in Torah and mitzvahs. And it's scary what he says. We can see people that sit and learn, but they're not in a high spiritual inside. They're not in a high spiritual level inside. Because there could be reasons that he's sitting and learning. Could be he's learning for covet, could be he's learning for money, could be he's learning. So, says Rabbi Yochanan to Rish Lakish, what are you bringing a raya? You're bringing a raya from that people sat and learned? Like I hold about the sins. The sins, it could be worse. But I look at them in a better eye because that inside they were good people. So it doesn't matter to me what's happening outside. If inside they're not good people, so the Torah that they're learning and the mitzvahs that are fulfilling, they're not worth it so much. Because when is a mitzvah worth it? And when is Torah worth it? If you're a good man. If you're learning Torah Lishma. But if in the same time, simultaneously, that you're sitting and learning, you could do something bad to your friend. You could have sinas chinam. So that's the answer, what Rabbi Yochanan is telling Rish Lakish. You're talking about how they're learning. I know, I saw. But that Torah is not an internal Torah. There's also in the Torah, like in sins, you have internal sins and external sins. The same thing you have also by Torah and mitzvahs. It depends what's going on inside. And that's why Rabbi Yochanan said that I don't care, it doesn't talk to me what they're learning, what they're doing. My main point is, what I'm saying, that the sin of the second temple is worse because that their position, the spiritual position inside wasn't good. They had sinas chinam. And it's not only the aveir of sinas chinam, it's really a sign of what's going in the heart of the person. Does he have a good heart or he has a bad heart? A person that has sinas chinam, it's a sign that his heart is not a good heart. His heart is not working the right way. And therefore, also, his learning and his mitzvahs, there's a different level how we look at it. We appreciate the Torah, any Torah that a person learns. But we appreciate a lot more when it's coming from a person that his heart is inside, his internal position, his spiritual position inside is good. But when that's bad, so Bechlan says, I don't care for what's going outside. We asked another question, the fourth question. Rabbi Yochanan said, when he tried to explain and to prove that the sin of the second temple was worse, so he brought a proof. He said, Biro Toichiach, the building of the Beis HaMikdash, that will be advice for us. What was worse? That it came back to the people of the first temple 70 years after, and after the second temple, we never was zeicher to have another Beis HaMikdash. But he said another sentence. Toivot tzipornom shel rishonim mikreison shel achronim. The fingernail of the people that lived in the time of the first temple is better than the stomach of the people that lived in the second temple. And the question is, what's the message that Rabbi Yochanan is trying to bring across to explain us more than the simple idea, just to understand that the sin that the people had in the time of the second temple was worse? And the answer is, the fingernail of the person is the part in the body that it's less connected to the body itself. And what's the part in the body that's the most connected to the body itself? Is the stomach of a person. That thing that Rabbi Yochanan is coming to say, that sentence, to compare the sins, what happened in the first Beis HaMikdash and happened in the second Beis HaMikdash, he came to compare it and to put the whole thing in this sentence. Like we know that in the parts of the body, there's something that's connected to the body, like the stomach, and there's something the most unconnected to the body is the fingernail of the person. The same thing is in the spiritual situation of a person. When a person does a sin, how much does it affect him? And when a person learns, how much does it affect him to good? So that's what he's saying. Toivot tzipornom shel rishonim. Even though that in the first temple they had 3 major averas, and they fell in those big averas, those 3 averas, but it did not affect so much their inside spiritual situation. It was like the nail, that the nail doesn't feel so much when something happens to the body. The nail doesn't feel so much. It did not affect so much. So even the nail, Toivot tzipornom shel rishonim, what does it come to say? That even also in a spiritual situation, there's things that a person fights them out, succeeds with them, and there's things that no. There's things that are closer, and there's things that are farther in his success to fight them out. Toivot tzipornom shel rishonim, the spiritual point is coming to tell us that even the things that are far, that I don't always succeed with them, but over there, their level was better. Toivot tzipornom shel rishonim, the spiritual things that are far from me, that I don't always succeed, but it was a better position than kreison shel achronim, than things that they had to deal with it every day. The people in the second temple, where they had sinas chinam. Sinas chinam is things that you find every day. And over there, they fell with something that was internal, that was bad from inside. So toivot tzipornom shel rishonim, when we want to think which spiritual situation, which level was better, which level was more, toivot tzipornom shel rishonim. The fingernail, that's an example for something that's far, but even though it did not affect those sins that they made, did not affect so much their personal, spiritual level. Mikreison shel achronim, it was even better than kreison shel achronim, is even the thing that a person has success when he fights it, with spiritual fight that he fights every day. But the people in the time of the first temple were better than even those things that they have to fight every day than the people in the second temple. Because the people in the second temple, that they had the sinas chinam, and they had an internal problem, their level in spiritual was less, even though the Averis itself, for sure, the Averis of the first temple were worse than the Averis of the second temple. So I learned with a bless that all of us should be zoiche to think deeply about those reasons and to try to correct and to be zoiche to correct, and b'zchut that we should have the binyan habayis hashlishi b'korev.